This is the new Process 205 transfer case. I pulled it out of my truck, which is a Chevy K20 1976 pickup, long bed. It's a K20 because K, meaning four-wheel drive, the transfer case has a front output, as opposed to a C series truck. C series is two-wheel drive. 20, meaning it's a 3/4 ton. So it's got the GM 14 bolt full float rear axle. Suspension and brake components also play into that. It came with all the consumable parts, you know, gaskets, seals, bearings, some of the small parts. And then I also bought a twin stick kit from JB Custom Fabrication. Then I picked up a donor case locally. I actually bought an NP205 and an SM465 together pretty cheap, which was nice because I got a couple of spare parts out of them. I ended up selling the SM465, pulled this apart, took some parts out of it. I've got my own SM465 that's gonna go back together soon as well. And it just mates up directly to this transfer case, whereas this one is gonna have a yoke here. So it's a divorce case. So this twin stick kit, it opens up a couple gear options for this case. In the stock configuration, you can only run this case in four-wheel drive, high or low, and two-wheel drive, high or low. But that two-wheel drive is restricted to the rear wheels. That's pretty typical for a truck. But with this kit, you can now move the shift rails independently. So you can actually leave the rear wheels in neutral and you can engage the front wheels either into low gear or high gear. So that's a big plus. The other plus is just how smooth this is. The old shifter, you just have your one stick and you gotta crank on it to get it into gear. These new ones are real smooth, and you saw that was a little bit hard to shift. You can adjust the pressure on those detent balls. Now it's easier. So that's up to you how much pressure you want. And that's just how hard that holds into the gear you choose. Obviously you don't want it loose, you don't want it flopping around, but if it's too stiff, it's gonna be hard to shift. So that's kind of nice, you can adjust your pressure. So yeah, right now I've got them both in neutral. This shift rail controls the rear drive shaft. This shift rail controls the front drive shaft. These shift rails just have a fork on them, and the fork slides the collar on the shaft, and it engages either the smaller gear for high or the larger gear for low. So I'm holding on to the rear stick. I can put it in low, neutral, high, neutral. Same thing with front. Low, neutral, high, neutral. I can do them together, bring them both back into high. So now I'm running four-wheel drive, high, up into neutral, or I can run them together in low. So four-wheel drive, low. What you can't do is cross shift high and low. So like if I've got my front in low, I can do two things with my rear. I can put it in low also, or I can put it in neutral. What I can't do is bring it back into high gear. And what actually physically prevents that from happening is these two metal rods. They're called pills, I think. I don't know if that's the technical term, but they go between the two shift rails, and they actually prevent that motion from happening, the cross shifting of high and low. And when you install this twin stick case, you have to grind down the rear shift rail just a little bit to allow a little bit more motion, but too much motion and you could cross shift. Cross shifting would be fine on the bench. If you're just spinning them by hand, who cares if the front and rear output shafts spin at different speeds? But when you actually put it in the truck is moving at one speed, let's say 5 miles an hour. So all the wheels got to be spinning at that speed. If you've got the front and the rear in different gears, the front wheels are going to be spinning at a different speed than the rear wheels. And something's going to bind up because obviously the truck is just moving at one speed. So you'll start breaking stuff. This is the gearing inside the case. It's not really ideal because I can't spin these without them running away from me, but these are the spare parts that I've got from my extra case. This is the front of the truck. This is the back. So this is the input from the transmission. This is the rear output. And this is the front output. This is the idler gear. These shift collars slide. All they do is select which one of these two gears will be connected to the output gear. And that determines the gearing. So if this gear is connected to the output, it's got 1-to-1 gearing. So no gearing is being done in the transfer case. It's just taking whatever gearing from the transmission, going straight through and out to the wheels. I'm holding the rear output in my hand. Right now the shift collar is in neutral. So neither one of these gears is tied to the output. If I slide the shift collar into high, now this gear and the output are locked together. So the power is going to come from the transmission. It's just going to go straight out the rear output. If the shift collar is locked onto this gear, now I'm using my low gear. So the input shaft is actually going to spin this gear, which will spin this gear, which will spin this gear, which is locked to my output, which spins my wheels. So this idler gear, it does two things. It allows power to get from the input over to the front output. And it also allows you to select which one of these gears you want to use. Do you want to use the high gear or the low gear? And like I showed you earlier, you cannot cross shift. So I can't have this one up in high and this one back in low, because like I said, that would bind up the drivetrain. It would be fine in the transfer case if you just had it on the bench. There's no problem with that. It's just when you've got wheels physically on the ground, you can't spin them at two different speeds on the same truck. Same thing with the front output. And neutral, the front output is not tied to either of these gears. When you slide the shift collar into high, now the front output is tied to this gear. It's locked on. If you slide the shift collar back here, now the front output is locked on to this gear where my thumb is, and the high gear just spins freely. Let's say I put both of these up into high gear. Power is going to come from the transmission. It's going to spin this gear, which is locked to my rear output. So this will spin. It's going to spin this gear, which is going to spin this gear, which is going to spin my front output and my front wheels. So now the rear output and the front output are both spinning in high gear. Now if I shift them both into low gear, power comes in from the transmission. It spins this gear, which spins this gear, which spins this, which spins this, which spins my rear output. This idler gear will also spin this gear, which will spin my front output. This gear will spin too, obviously, but it's not actually driving anything because it's not locked to the front output. It's just spinning freely. And I think it's a little bit tricky to think about because, you know, I've got my shift collar locking this gear onto my output, but this gear is still engaged. It's still spinning. But what you got to remember is that it's not actually driving the front output in this setup, because as you can see, that gear is just spinning freely. It's actually this gear that's locked on to my front output shaft. So it can be a little bit tricky that they're all meshed up all the time, but you just got to remember the one that's actually locked on to the output shaft is the one that matters. The other one's just spinning freely. It's just along for the ride. The gearing in the case is very similar to that of a bicycle. It's all the same principles, just gear ratios. So on this bike, I don't have a front derailleur. I've just got one gear option for my drive gear. In the back, I've got a bunch of different options for the driven gear. This one, which is relatively large, will give me slow rotational speed on this wheel, but it'll give me high torque. So I'd use that on an uphill. If I shifted into this gear, it's relatively small, a small driven gear. So that will give me high speed, but low torque. So once you get up to speed, you get your momentum up, you'd use that on a downhill or a flat. It's all about the drive gear and the driven gear. Any gears in between them don't matter. It's just the size of the drive, the size of the driven. So in the case of the front wheel drive, I've got my drive gear, and then I can either select this as the driven gear or this. If I select this one, now my drive gear and my driven gear are the same size. So torque coming in is the same as the torque going out. However, if I lock this gear onto my drive shaft, now my driven gear is bigger than my drive gear. So I'm gonna have more torque going out, but less speed. Just like we looked at on the bike. Bigger driven gear, more torque, less speed. You'll see I've got a couple holes in my case. Those are to access the roll pins, which connect your shift rails to your shift forks. So obviously mine's all assembled. I'm ready to button it up. But that's actually one of the first steps to taking a case apart. What you do is you take a punch and you punch those freeze plugs into the case. They fall into the bottom. You'll retrieve them later. And then you use a roll pin, a punch, to punch that roll pin out of the shift fork and shift rail. And it will also just fall into the bottom of the case. Then your shift fork will slide freely on the shift rail, so you can slide the shift rail out. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to get that shift rail out. So it took me a while, but it's one of those things, if I did it again, it would take a 20th of the time. I don't know when I'll do it again, but it was fun. It's always fun starting with something you don't understand. By the end, you can close your eyes and visualize it. And I was pretty happy to have these extra parts actually laying around, so that once I got this case put back together, I could still think about it a little bit and visualize what exactly is going on. Hope this helps. I recommend it. These cases are, yeah, it's fun. It's like a fossil, you know, rebuild it, get it back on the road another 50 years. And they're tricky, at least for me. But once you get to the end, it all makes sense. It's pretty fun. Go pick one up.